It's about to go down with Marc and Cathey, a live coaching show about dropping ideas. Marc and Cathey coach and have conversations with brilliant idea creators who are reimagining the world through the expression of their words, thoughts, and action.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to It's About to Go Down. I am Marc Williams.
And I'm Cathey Armillas, and I'm really excited to have my friend Paul Brown on. Paul is the president of a tech recruiting company, of many other things, an engineer at heart, but really just a really freaking good human. And today, one of the ideas that he'll be talking to us about fits in the space of what he does a lot in his professional and his personal life, which he cares deeply about social issues. And he's always trying to look for that creative way to solve them. And today, what we're going to start off with is this new idea that Paul's been collaborating with some other folks in the community on how to help mitigate the homeless problem in Portland. It's a bad problem here, and there's lots of people trying to do lots of things, but Paul is working with some other folks to find a very creative way to kind of address at least some of it. So Paul, welcome to our show. So happy to have you here.
Thanks, Cathey. Great to see both of you. It's I've been a fan for a while now, so it's exciting to be on finally.
I love it. So Paul, tell us about this. We're kind of excited to hear this creative thing you've been working on.
Yeah, I would shorten it to say that we have a lot of vacant office space physically here in Portland, probably far too much, frankly. And the way that a lot of commercial leases work is they are usually 5 to 7 years long. Very few leases have been signed since the start of the pandemic anywhere. And so we are going to have even more commercial office space available here in Portland over the next couple of years. At the same time, we're seeing our unhoused population grow rapidly. And, the economy is not necessarily looking better for a lot of people that are staring up at the daunting task of how they're going to get enough money to get themselves into shelters that are stable and safe and long lasting. So I'm exploring the idea of how would we actually use some of that vacant space to get people into shelters as soon as possible. Into shelter. One of the things I've learned is there's a lot of nuances in the language, so we'll have to talk through some of that, I guess. But for the purpose of being simple, I'll just say to get people off the street and into someplace safe.
Paul, I love to just start off real quick with this. I mean, this is an ongoing issue, right? And I know my brother and sister here from the West Coast have it serious on the West Coast. We got our issues on the East Coast as well. And Paul, as I'm sure you know, like a lot of people have been trying to tackle this issue, right? So in your opinion, in your experience, what has made this so difficult that it has now inspired you to take this on?
Great question. I think that I'm at a moment, I turn 50 next month, and I'm at a moment where I'd really like to see a higher percentage of my personal time spent on making a difference in the world than making a profit in the world. And so I've been moving in this direction for years. And this is an issue that I come back to over and over again. As I've been exploring, what other work would I do? How else will I show up in the community? One of the interesting things that I keep running into is I keep ending up in this prioritization struggle where I could find a group of people that I might be able to work for their betterment. But every time I get to that part of the conversation, I end up stuck in this idea that I'm going to end up stepping over people who are sleeping on the street in order to go deliver that service to the people that I think I can help. And so every time I go down this path, I end up thinking, yeah, but what about those less fortunate? And there are probably people much less fortunate, even than the unhoused people on the West Coast. Certainly, certainly, there's a lot of political think pieces about the unhoused people on the West Coast, but it doesn't change the fact that just this past January, we had more than a week where there was snow and ice on the ground and temperatures, well below freezing. And there were a lot of efforts to emergency shelter people for sure. But it just really, to me, highlighted that I have an opportunity to use the network that I have and the sort of, for lack of a better word, engineering mindset to actually figure out how we would get um, more of these community members into spaces that would not be so vulnerable as to what they're choosing or having forced upon them in the current situation. So it's more of a I think it's more of a calling than like a scientific. I've figured out exactly what the problem is and I'm going to go solve it. And the rallying cry of using the vacant commercial office space in Portland, which we're talking millions of square feet of space that's just not occupied at all right now. It's a thing that activates people. It's a little bit more of a good catchphrase at this point than a clear plan. But I like the idea that I can get people's attention with that sort of big idea, and then we can figure out what the actual work looks like once we get their attention.
Mm. I like that you said that, Paul, and I'm assuming that there's a lot. I mean, on the surface, it's such a good idea. There's a lot of hope in that idea. There's a lot of love and empathy and care and wanting to help other people. And at the same time, nothing anymore is easy. Everything is political, and I'm sure you've already hit some roadblocks and things, and it's tough. So I would love to just get some of that out in the open, just meaning like what are some of the challenges? What are some of the things that people are going to be very much against?
Great. Yeah, that's a really good place to start. There's plenty of that.
Yeah, I figured.
We might need two shows. Okay, so here's a couple of things that so far really stand out to me as challenges to be tackled. Um, so the first one is, let's talk about the physical space that we're referring to. For the most part, commercial office real estate is usually in a high-rise sort of building. Let's assume somewhere between 3 and 10 floors. There are bigger, there are smaller, but if we're talking about, I think at scale, you'd have to be thinking in terms of a multi-floor physical building. So a couple obstacles. First one is, odds are that the building is usually rented in at a floor level or at less than a floor level, but it's very rarely as an entire building. There's just, in most businesses will go in and they'll rent the space that they need plus a little bit of growth. And so there will be, in most of the physical buildings that we'll be looking at, there will be tenants today. And those tenants will definitely not be happy if we're suddenly creating a situation where their workers are going to be less likely to use the office, or in some way that if they use the office, let's say to meet clients, where they feel their clients might be less likely to arrive, regardless of if it actually happens that way. That will be the connotation, right? There's an unfortunate tendency to conflate unhoused populations and public safety issues. And I'm not saying that there's no correlation between there, but mentally, people are going to make that connection long before they actually see it happen on the ground. So I think coming up with a solution that doesn't create tension between paying tenants and then presumably unpaying tenants, I think that's one of the things.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is, there's a lot of building codes and zoning restrictions that have to that basically make this harder for you to physically locate people into a building that today is laid out for an office space. And I'll just give one example because I think it's something we can all really relate to quite easily. If you think about most large floor plan buildings where maybe there's, I don't know, 10,000 square feet on the floor or 50,000 square feet on the floor, just the really big office buildings, typically the bathrooms are located in maybe one or two locations. either way, no matter how many locations, they tend to be consolidated in a certain area. The way that residential zoning in these sorts of buildings works today, there's at least a precedent that says you basically would need to have a bathroom for each residential unit, so that the people obviously have some privacy and some control over their dedicated space, and the buildings just aren't laid out for that. And it would be quite challenging to actually deconstruct those centralized bathrooms and spread them out over a whole floor. So that's just one example. I think there's more than this. But, you know, in a very real sense, speaking for myself, I went to a 4-year school, and I lived in the dorm all 4 years. I want to estimate that there was about 50 rooms to a floor. They were all one gender at that time, but 50 rooms to a floor that was all sharing one consolidated bathroom, which had maybe, I'm going to guess, 10 to 12 stalls, plus it was men's bathroom, so it had urinals as well, and showers. And, you know, at least in that connotation, that was what was expected from the space. We were sharing bathrooms as a whole, and, you know, you certainly got to keep those clean, and that's not a trivial effort. But it's a perfect example to me of a solvable problem. But you've now got to unpack the politics around the building codes and the politics around the residential zoning, and you've got to get people to approve those changes. You can't just arbitrarily be like, I'm going to build a dorm. That doesn't work that way. So you got to kind of work through that. So I think that's maybe we'll collectively call that the zoning and the building code regulations. I think another piece is that what I have learned in the time that I've been researching this is that the collective space, for lack of a better word, the collective space that is available to people who need housing support gets sliced up into really unique types of housing. So there's temporary shelters, which tend to be things like, oh, that's really cold or it's really hot outside. We need to get people into something. At least in the Portland area, although I'm sure it's not unique to Portland, we have these things we call safe rest villages, which are little tiny homes that are usually grouped together, maybe on a large lot in a residential area. And so these safe rest villages are considered temporary shelters. The idea is not that they'd be there the people would be there that long, although in some cases they are. Then there's transitional housing. Then there's something known as permanent supported housing, which would be, for example, people with mobility limitations or mental health challenges that really prevent them from sort of re-entering the workforce. And then there's affordable housing. And I'm sure people who are watching this that are way more versed in housing than me would tell you that you can get those even more granular. But that delineation, among other things, it affects the grants and the funding and that sort of thing that you have access to. It affects where you're going to actually find the people who will become residents for your space. It affects how many workers you need, like paid positions in terms of service delivery. It affects how and where you're going to locate the physical space. So that in particular has become a pretty fascinating thing to dig in on. So I would say that's probably a good stopping point, just some of the issues that I've encountered. And each of them warrant probably hours and hours of conversations, but yeah, that's probably a good spot.
Well, I'm curious, Paul, that, and thank you, Cathey, for that question. In answering that, you use a term that I'd love to pick your brain on.
Yeah.
Solvable problem.
Ah.
Right? You set up all of the obstacles.
Right.
So what's the idea for the solvable problem? What's the solution? Or if we don't want to use the word solution, what's the approach that you are suggesting?
And before you answer that, Paul, Marc, I love you so much. I love that we're writing down the same things. And I'm like, our brains, I felt melded on that. I just want to add another layer to that, Marc, because I love that you asked that. I feel like what you're trying to do here, Paul, is not just say, not allow the, oh, we can't do this. There's so many layers to it. it's more like you're saying one of two things. Either how can we do this, or or how could we use our, creative brain and problem solving mechanisms to maybe even come up with a different idea if this one isn't the one, if I'm right. So Mark, I just wanted to add
Love
that
that.
piece to it.
Love that.
For sure, it is possible that the effort to figure out how to use vacant commercial office real estate to put people into housing and shelters is actually not where I will end up. And I think that's actually one of the things I'm most, when I reached out to you, Cathey, about, I finally know what I want to talk about with you and Mark. It's very much in this space. I think some of what I'm hoping comes out of our conversation today is just framing this a little bit crisper, or maybe looking at it a little bit better. The I, I'll tell a brief story about when I'm a big proponent of racially diversifying workplaces. And that's an easy thing to say, maybe, but it's not a very easy thing to do. And as I've continued to sort of dig in on why are workplaces not more racially diverse, why wouldn't they reflect all the communities where they exist? I would say that I describe myself as coming to these problems with an engineering mindset. And for me, what that means is really trying to take sections of the problem and get an understanding of them that's crisp enough that then I can say, and this is how we would tackle X. As you may have noticed, our workplaces collectively are still not very racially diverse, so I haven't necessarily solved that problem yet. However, I think that as sort of an engineering mindset, there's a premise that problems are knowable. We can understand, in essence, quote unquote, all the variables that are affecting why things are the way they are. And then we can figure out the right collection of people and knowledge and effort and funding and money in order to get together the right energy to address what that problem is. So in this case, as an example, one of the things that I found out recently is that on the affordable housing side of this conversation, which is where people would actually sign a lease and stay in a physical, like, let's call it an apartment, for lack of a better word. We right now have like a 9% vacancy rate in Portland, and there are organizations in town, just in case they don't want this information out, I won't name them, but I've talked to people who are doing really great work around housing that, have set a goal of getting 100 people into housing by Christmas, for example. So that's about 2 months from the day we're recording this. I love that idea. I think that's a really good, measurable idea. I didn't realize that was a thing that was hard, right? I think part of where we end up is we tend to think about the fact that we just don't have enough physical stock of places where people could live. And I don't know that I feel like that any longer. There's always need to build more, just in general. That's true. And it's also true that the bucket we call housing, which is frequently what's meant when you say affordable housing, that there actually is some right now that does not locally have people in it. So then you got to figure out, okay, why doesn't it have people in it? You got to dig in on that a little bit more. And I found out some answers to that. I'm sure there are more, but it turns out that what happens a lot when we put people in affordable housing is that they're actually somewhat removed from the services that they need. And in being removed from the services that they need, they find themselves in situations which then prevent them from feeling like they can stay or being allowed to stay in this more lease, apartment-y kind of setup that's a more permanent solution, but requires a certain amount of, we'll say, like, compliance with whatever the rules are to stay in that space. So an example that was given to me, which I don't know how often this happens, I don't have this data, but an example that was given to me is the idea that people might get into an affordable housing solution and they haven't had housing for a long time. And in that place, they may feel like they need to dry their clothes, and they might put them on the stove. And in putting them on the stove, now they might catch fire, and then the building itself is negatively impacted, not just the unit that they're in. And then they basically are removed or kicked out or asked to leave the housing that they had. And so, again, I hope that's not happening that often, but it was given to me as an example to say there's a lot of people who end up in affordable housing but just aren't able to stay in that housing. So, when we have in Portland right now, the number is somewhere upwards of 6,000 people that are unhoused on a given night. In the summer, Portland is beautiful. And frankly, that might not necessarily be the hardest part about being unhoused. I think there's a whole bunch of challenges, but the physical environment might not be that bad. But in the wintertime, it gets pretty miserable, rainy and cold. And I think, many people would choose to be some sort of shelter as opposed to being stuck out in the weather. But if the requirements for being in that shelter don't match what they're able to, again, I'll use the word comply, to sort of comply with, then they end up losing access to some of their options.
I'm just going to ask this question. This might seem like it's taking us in a different direction, but as I hear you talk about this, Paul, and I know that you want to frame your approach in a particular way, is it okay if I take you back to your earliest childhood memory? And I'm curious, what was the moment or the memory that you attach to having a home?
I moved a lot as a kid, which for the most part was actually a positive experience for me. I had a very stable family life, and even though we physically relocated often, it wasn't a particularly traumatic experience. However, what it did do is I don't have like a hometown. I've never gone to a high school reunion, for example, even though I went to multiple high schools. However, my family is actually from southwestern Nova Scotia, which is a very rural community. And in my experience growing up, I would go to this rural Nova Scotia every summer, and all of my blood relatives lived there, 100% of them. So I had no blood relatives in the US at that time. And what's interesting is I now that I'm older, when I go back there, it occurs to me that that is sort of what I now think of as home, right? I don't, like, my parents are still alive, but where they live, I was only lived there for like a year or two before I moved off to college and so on. So that's not home for me, Home is actually this place in Nova Scotia. And I think that on a recent trip there, something that really stood out to me about going to that location was we would have these big communal meals, sometimes 15, 20 people for lunch, right? Because we were all back there. We were, everyone was happy to see us. And so it was a very fun and positive, like, let's gather for a meal. And at the end of every single meal that we had over a 10-day period, there would be a discussion about who in the community was most in need of what we had for leftovers. So there would be a conversation that would say, oh, well, John just worked 2 shifts at the fire hall, so we should bring some of these leftovers to him. Or I'm changing people's names, but or Joanne, her son is in town with his 2 daughters, and so she's got extra mouths to feed. We should bring these to her. And it really impacted me because at first I didn't even register it, because every time I go up there, that's always how it's been. But after a while, it occurred to me that, some of these people might not even know we were going to be bringing food to them. And it was totally normal to just show up at these people's houses unannounced, no phone call, no email, no calendared event, right? And to show up with them with just food and offer to them and them to be grateful. And it really reignited my feeling about community.
Mm,
Sometimes we'll talk about the fact that I really like networking, which
mm,
is true, but I prefer the term community building. And that's really how I see what I'm doing there. And when I think about community, I always go back to that place in Nova Scotia. And so this is kind of a longer answer maybe than you were looking for, but like for me,
mm,
the there's an aspect of empathy that we're sort of forced to shut down when we're having to walk through the streets of a city that we all love and care about and see these people who are clearly suffering, and there's just no way that we can basically help all of them, right?
mm,
I'll clean out my pockets if I can and pass out whatever I got along the way, but eventually I'm going to run out of stuff in my pockets, whatever that is. And you're right back to the situation where there's still going to be more people in line. And so I think the way I look at this particular problem, which is thousands of people without a solution for shelter in the city that I really think is a pretty great city.
mm,
The problem that I run into is it doesn't really matter to me how many people are working on this problem. It's not solved. And this is a city, the way I look at Portland is it's just small enough that a group of the right energied people should be able to affect real change. So
mm,
I see that's why I come back to the solvable, knowable problem piece, right? There's only so many people in this city that are actually making decisions about what's going to happen to this population of people. And they're all trying. Let's just start from the premise that every one of the people who's working anything in housing at all, their heart's in the right place. Every minute of the day that they're working, they're trying really hard to solve this problem. And so I don't know that I'm smarter than them or better than them or in any other way going to bring something drastically different than they've all thought to the table. But I does feel like then we just need more bodies rowing in this direction. And so
mm,
to me, that's really the calling is like, I just don't want to turn off that empathy anymore. These are
mm,
members of my community.
mm,
And that's the part that I'm really drawn to do something with.
mm. To me, that's been the big idea since I've heard you talk, Paul, is I feel like if somebody was watching this, they might have the urge to go to pick at what you're talking about and pick apart the problems. That's why I wanted to talk about it first. I want to hit it on the mouth first. But I think the bigger idea is that you're showing up with a creative brain, an open heart, and you're wanting to solve or help mitigate or help, lessen
Contribute to, yeah, yeah.
contribute to however we want to describe this, because like you said, some of this stuff just feels completely unsolvable. And I love that as the bigger idea. I don't know if you were feeling that too, Mark, but I feel like if I had to pull an idea out of this, and if this were like a TED Talk, for instance, I would be like, just take this, what Paul's doing, and apply it to anything, because what he's really just doing is trying to say, hey, I'm here. I have a brain, I have resources, I have connection, build community. How can we? Not we cannot. How
Right,
can we?
right.
If we could, I even love the example you gave, Paul, of the goal of this organization trying to start with 100. Because if you start with 100 and you just take a chunk of it and you go, okay, there's over 6,000 people on any given night. How do you just find a space and a place and a shelter for 100 people? Then maybe we could replicate that. And Mark, I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to pull something in from another one of our episodes. Our friends Josh and Marcus came on to our show. And if you haven't watched it, it's a really good episode where they took this thing and they have this thing called the idea science. And what they do is they solve problems. They look at other things that are unrelated and they add the brilliance of that to solve another problem, which I feel like is what you're doing anyway. And they do it in this
Totally.
like wild way of like look at a musician that's doing this, but then how can you take the things from what they did here and solve it over here? Anyway, those are my thoughts top level, as I feel like the bigger idea to this, Paul, isn't the exact issue. It's how can we get into a room, have a conversation, create new ideas, be the red box to the blockbuster, because the blockbuster
Right,
can't work anymore.
right. Yeah, one of the, Cathey, one of the things you probably would agree about is that I love convening people. I love bringing people together. In truth, I really think communication is the solution to almost every problem once we unpack it enough. And so, one of the things I'm going to start asking some of the people I'm meeting with is like, what are the big, where's the big conference that happens across agency, across government institution in Portland where we get all these people that are working on this stuff together for them to share ideas and kind of tackle through what's not working. And I really want to be clear. I'm not saying such a thing does not exist, but there's something there. And unfortunately, this work does get very politicized, and there are lots of like literal political interests in how it gets solved. And so, it may end up that my big idea is less about physically taking a space and making it so someone could live there, and much more about bringing all the people together who are already doing that and getting them to talk and share ideas. I think I think I got to find out who's already doing that. But if that's not happening regularly, that's an opportunity from my perspective.
Paul, I gotta say, maybe there's other people out there doing it. I don't ever think nowadays that's the question. I think the question is, how can I do what maybe other people are doing in my own unique way?
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Totally.
you said, I love bringing people together. I've heard you say that, the best part of being well networked, right? And then you talked about in Nova Scotia, the big communal meal.
Yeah.
And after the big communal meal, you stay around the table and have this discussion about who's most in need of our leftovers. Like, I'm just trying to figure out, what does that look like? What is that big communal meal around this table in a home in Nova Scotia where you have this discussion afterwards about who to go to unannounced and share a meal with? Like, what does that look like in this space
Yeah.
of this new idea?
Yeah. I love that, Mark, so much, right? It's like you take that overlaying of like who's in need, who's in need most of what we have that's left over. And if everybody thought that way, that's like a true community, right? That's really what community means. We're there for each other, we're there to support each other. And so I love that this conversation is less about the idea that Paul himself is working on and more about doing that in other ways in other places. Because you know what, Paul, you probably, I bet you've already run into this, but the only way you're going to find out if somebody else is doing this is by start trying to do it. Then you'll find out, because then somebody, right?
Exactly right, Cathey.
Because then somebody will be like, oh, well, so-and-so's doing this. And you're like, but you would have never found that out. So to the people that would criticize anybody to say, hey, there's already people working on this, it's like, well, the effort that you put will lead you there. It will get you in the room with the people that are trying to do it. And I think that's really important. I feel like from a societal place, I mean, one of the things you've inspired me on, Paul, is to just be like, where can I raise my hand and say, hey, I have leftover. How can I contribute it to my community? What's my leftover? And for instance, I'm going to tell you about something my sister and I dreamed up a couple of years ago, before the pandemic. We had our little family presentation day where we all get on and we do presentations. And one day in particular, we were working on fake businesses, but we just were trying to use the art of pitching. And my sister and I had this idea of how can you help parents that don't live in your city? Like our mom, like many other people's moms, is not very tech savvy, right? Can't do a lot of tech things, and but we're not there. And so it's frustrating to be on the phone and be like, we got to press this and da, da, da. And so we had this idea, and we didn't ever come up with the name, I don't think. But we had this idea of like, how could you create a system where Paul, in your town, wherever your parents live, somebody would volunteer their time to come over and help your parents with something that they needed. And then in my town, where I live, I can help somebody else's parents. It's almost like this is big, like you put in time because you know somebody's putting in time for your parents. Anyway, that that idea that, and we thought it would be an app, by the way, that you just kind of, you log your parents into
Like
it or
Task
whatever.
Rabbit for parents.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly what it would be. But I feel like that's what's bubbling in my head about this is like, how can you stand up and say, "Hey, I want to contribute to the betterment of my city." And Mark, I'm sure you feel this in New York, right? Because here in Portland, we've gotten a lot of like bad press about Portland. Portland, I'm just going to say it, Portland's fucking gorgeous. It's one of the best places to live in the world.
Wait, we can curse on this show?
Yeah, we can curse on this show.
What gates have opened?
Oh, it's gonna open. And I don't care what people say. Like, I love my city. And I think most people do. When you have a place that you call home and when that's where you put your heart, that's where your community is, you want it to be the best place possible. So instead of crapping on it and just saying, oh, it's turned to this. Well, so many cities all across the world have went through downturns. So anyway, I love that you're just trying to raise your hand and say, let's make this a better Portland to live in for everybody.
Yeah. I took some notes during that, both of you. First, I just want to highlight, Mark, I actually don't know if this was deja vu or if I literally heard you give this advice to another guest maybe a few seasons ago about it's not so much whether someone's already doing it, but it's how are you doing it in your own unique way. However, whether I've heard you say that before or I'm imagining I heard you say it before is powerful. That struck me in a very deep way. So I love that. Um, you know, Cathey, one of the things that, so I'm very, very blessed in that I know lots and lots of people, and I've been able to meet with many people that are doing really great work in this space. One of the interesting things I've encountered is there are a lot of spaces in my experience where people can volunteer in general. You can volunteer to help feed people. You can volunteer to give clothing. You can volunteer to go actually visit people on the street. Although in general, you should have some training before you go do that. You can volunteer in workforce development, doing mock interviews and reviewing people's resumes. There's always some place where you can volunteer. And one of the things that's been really interesting so far in my like digging into what's happening in this space, it's very difficult to volunteer as it relates to housing people. I mean, like we get really, really literal and say, well, if you have a spare room in your house, then you should house somebody. But I want to emphasize we should not discount how important it is to have services attached to efforts to get people into housing, that those two things really are very tightly tied. Many people are experiencing a wide variety of trauma as a result of being in a unstable housing situation. And we should not assume you can just open your door and bring in somebody and it's going to go great. So I don't want to suggest that. But at the same time, there's really no way to do that end of meal communal who's in need and how can we help kind of experience. And whether it's an app or not, I think remains to be seen. But there's an interesting conversation to be had around how do we actually make this into a space where people can get more involved without having to leave a full-time job to go work in a different full-time job altogether to say that they're contributing to actually addressing this housing crisis. And I think there's I'm certainly making a note. I think there's something more to be thought of there. A part of what I'm in a dream world that probably doesn't exist, I'm going to find something where there's a potential need in this space and my skills and network are a potential match for that need. And there's something unique about that combination of my skills, my energy, and the need that like I'm filling something that's using my skills in a unique way to do something that might already be happening. So I think I don't know what that is, but I think there's something worth continuing to poke on there. And me scheduling a convening and starting to invite people is the easiest thing I can imagine doing. So like, let's assume I'm going to start that sooner than later.
Yeah. I love that because when you get the people in the room too, you start if there are 10 people in the room, you have 100,000 more ideas than you would have had for anything that you can do yourself. And same for
Right.
them. You get a room full of people and these ideas start catching fire and going different directions. And I think that's what's most powerful about getting people together. And I love this visual. Mark, I'm glad you brought it back up. I love this visual of the communal family meal and the discussion after, because that discussion probably, again, it probably created the nuances of like, oh, so and so has somebody in, has some extra people in town. And maybe one person wouldn't have thought of that. And then all of a sudden these meals show up at the house. I mean, what an awesome gift. And what a gift for people out in the community when, Paul and people like Paul are, using their resources and their brains and their networks to try to make a difference. And so I'm just feeling like so excited and like inspired by it all.
We talk uh, we talk about belonging and inclusion, or inclusion and belonging. And one of the things that I believe about really actually feeling like you belong in a group and really feeling like you're included is some confidence that when you're not in the room, your name is coming up occasionally and others are thinking about you, right? And
Mm,
so the like in that situation where people might arrive at your front door with a big pot of spaghetti or whatever. These are not 5-star meals. These are people they're working folk, right? But someone might show up at your front door with a big pot of spaghetti. Then what you know is that somewhere there was a group of people putting food together that was
mhm.
thinking about you. And I think that that's a really powerful sentiment.
It's very powerful.
That is powerful. Cathey, you used the word resources, and as you used the word resources, um, I went back to a question you asked earlier, which was, "What's your leftover?"
Yeah.
That just
Yeah.
really stood out to me.
Yep.
I
Wrote that
think
down.
it's
Yep.
like if people could ask themselves, "What's your leftover?"
Yeah.
You know, that'd be fascinating. Although I got to tell you, one pet peeve. And I don't know if there's a Portland issue, but it's definitely a New York issue. All right. So I'm on the New York City subway, and somebody's dancing, singing, playing an instrument, or maybe they're just flat out asking for money because they're hungry. And my heart pours out, and I don't have any loose change. I probably only got a $20 bill in my pocket. All right, let's be real. Nobody carries cash. I probably got a debit card in my pocket. I'm not giving them that, and I'm not Venmoing them any money, right? But I do have maybe an extra piece of fruit or a bag of chips that I didn't eat for lunch. That's my leftover. And yet there's been some people who are like, nope. I actually had an unhoused person once say that he didn't actually feel comfortable because he didn't know where it was from.
Mm,
And so he wouldn't take it. And it's interesting I bring that up because there's a lot of people who express being very perturbed by that. Like, you're hungry. You're asking if I'm giving you food. Um, and so I'm hoping that people don't get turned off by the idea of what's your leftover, because I do think that there's a lot of value in that. Um, and I'm just wondering, do you anticipate that whatever the leftover in the world of housing might be, that there might be some unhoused people who might not be open to taking those leftovers?
mm. That's a good question, Mark.
Thought about this one quite a bit actually, because I
Mm,
think there's another half of that, which is it's easy for me to say when I was 18, I didn't mind living in a dorm and sharing a bathroom with 50 or 100 other men. That's not the
mhm,
same as when you're, 45 and maybe you'd really like some privacy.
mhm, mhm.
Um, an alarming statistic I've learned as I've dug into this is the fastest growing demographic within the unhoused community are people over the age of 55. That is frightening. And,
Mm.
any sort of pride that those people might have would be the kind of thing that might have them say, I can't really accept your leftover. I, I think there's a couple of different thoughts on this. One is uh, the story that I told about Nova Scotia feels like community to me because my that is my literal family. And when I'm up there, there is no differentiating between family by blood and family by choice. Um, there are several. My grandmother, who turns 101 next month, um,
Wow.
she raised three kids of her own. She lost three kids early in their youth, and she adopted three kids. And so there is no difference. I don't like they're all my aunties and my uncles and so on, and I don't see them as different, and nobody up there does either. And that extends to the sort of non-blood family relations that are also at these same gatherings. So I think, boy, now you're going to have me go way off topic, but we can cut this later. I think that we are basically fed stories about how we are different and apart and separate. And, those stories cause us to see each other very differently than we would see like this chosen community of both blood family and also people that are in our lives that are not blood. I think that um, so I think on the giver side, uh, you know, those stories are going to still happen. The idea that you have a leftover, and frankly, like it even feels awkward, right? Giving somebody your leftovers, that's something that you are discarding, and you're saying, yeah, but you could use it. And there's I don't know, there's a mental block on that. It feels awkward. Like I'm giving you the stuff that I don't actually want, right? Um, and yet there are plenty of people who actually want that desperately. Certainly, I'm sure I'm not the only one, but in my neighborhood, we put our trash can and I recycle on the curb every night. And there are people going around picking up bottles and cans in the hopes that they can get a few dollars for those at the refund location. So like there's also people out there who have reached a point in their life where I'm not saying they're happy about it, but they're willing to sort of take that leftover, if you will. And so certainly I can make it a more positive experience than picking through my garbage can. I can certainly do something
Mm.
to make that better. And I think a little bit is also how we approach it. If the leftover is only made available after I'm discarding it, then that's a very different connotation than if I sit down at a table and I say, I have this huge meal available to me. I'm consciously not going to eat a third of it. I don't know, that's sort of an arbitrary number, but I'm not going to eat a third of it. And I'm going to instead make sure that that is put together or prepared or offered in a way that's much more appealing than like, I don't want this anymore. I do think you can change some of the narrative, but it requires intention because frankly, like leftover could easily be like I eat half an apple, Mark, and it's got my teeth marks in it, and then I hand it
Yeah.
to you because you didn't have an apple today, and like you should say
Yeah.
no, thank you, right?
I love that you said that, Paul. We were on the same track. When you were talking, I was thinking it's just a rebrand of the word leftover because it's like no matter how good a meal is in my home, at some point it's fulfilled me and it's not the stuff that I had on my plate necessarily. And so it's just a metaphor for whatever in your life, you know. It's not necessarily the piece. We think about it that way, and so you have to rebrand it. It's not the piece that I didn't want. It's the piece that I don't need above and beyond, you know. It's the piece that I can offer. It's the amount that I will put into the community jar at a church, or it's the amount that I'm willing to spend on other people. It's the amount that I can give because I have extra. It's not the things that I don't want. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it's if we're going with this metaphor, You know, Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday,
Me too, me too.
right? It's not what I didn't finish on my plate. It's everything that was on the main dish that I put in the Tupperware bowl.
Mm.
That's the leftover.
Yeah, which
It's
most people
not
really
the
get excited about the next day. They're excited to eat those
right,
Yes,
leftovers, right?
yes. Thanksgiving for a week.
yes.
Totally
Yeah.
right.
Stretchy
It's
pants
totally
the
right.
whole time.
Yeah.
One thing I've been thinking about is this idea of I'm sure you've heard this language, but like, what is a basic human right? And I think you'll hear
Mm.
sometimes that housing is a basic human right, or even food is a basic human right. And I've been thinking about this a lot as I've been digging in on this, because in a world where we think of housing, food, let's throw clothing in there. Let's throw healthcare in there. I want to stop short of gainful employment. I have other thoughts on that we can come to in a minute, but like these cornerstone things that you need to survive in a world where you have at least some kind of guaranteed access to a minimum level of housing, food, healthcare. And there's ways that you can get quote unquote better or upgraded. So we still live in a, capitalist society. But as long as there's like a floor to how bad it can get, I do think that would have the potential to really change the conversation about what is expected from people in those moments, and it would create a lot more options for the people who are either unable to participate at a higher level or choosing to not participate at a higher level, which I do still feel we need to make space for. Um, in my world where we live in, where we offer a dorm style setup to people who might not want to commit to a long term lease where they have to pay a rent and utilities every month, there's a they're having to make a trade off, right? There is no there's no glamour in living in a communal bathroom kind of setup. It's just a step above having to live on the street with no control at all over your own security or your climate or that sort of thing. So I think, if we could come up with like, what could we all agree is a bare minimum that anybody should have access to? And we say you'll never have to have less than that. And that would include food and so on. Um, I think that's an interesting path, because at that point, then if somebody wanted to figure out how they could skill up and go get a gainfully paying job and then get a better apartment or a car or nicer clothes, whatever that thing is, I think we've given them a choice now where they have more control over that situation. Where it's at today, once you get to that affordable housing level, you're basically committing, I'm going to work every day so that I can stay in this housing thing, because I don't want to end up back on the street. I don't want to end up in a shelter. I don't want to end up in a temporary solution. And I feel like we're actually removing a lot of choices once we move to that kind of mentality. Like, you must have a job in order to keep this particular place. We've taken some choices away from folks.
Mm.
Powerful.
I have a thought on this because Paul, I like that you're referencing. I love that we're talking about all sides of this, and I'm going to go back to the other side of it for a second again. I believe that what you're doing, Paul, in this idea and other things that I know you've been involved with, by the way, Paul Brown is involved in so many things. This is not the only thing, right? He cares about social issues. And I think one of the things that you're starting to really make me see is that if we start to create our communities with a heart where everybody's center place is what's the little thing that I could add, or the bigger or the medium, whatever, right? What's the thing that I could add for other people and center it there, as opposed to this space where we're like, what can I get? What can I keep? What can I not share? It doesn't matter how small that impact over the multitudes of people, it will make a really big impact. Because I think people get overwhelmed when they think if they can't solve something, they then don't do anything. But if you think about the little bits, and that requires recentering yourself out of like what can I do for me? And it's like, what's the thing that I can do? Like, I was just thinking while you were talking, Paul, I was like, I don't know if I would take my 4 grandkids onto the streets and give like food to the houseless, but can I have the 4 of them here at my house, and then we go to the store and we figure out what things we could give that are brand new, not half eaten, right? Like, and could we put something together, and then I do something else with somebody else or give it to another organization. So it's just, it makes your brain start to go, what can I do, not what can't I do? So it's moving that center. That's where my brain's been going.
I'm going a step further, Cathey, and it's just in that example with the 4 grandkids. One of the things that I envision in a multi-story, 100+ people residence is we also need a solution for children, and frankly, we need a solution for pets, and we need a solution for cars. But let's focus on children right now. Like
Yeah.
the part of what we need is play dates, and we need socialization, and we need them to feel like they're not isolated into a space where there's only people that are struggling the most, and they're having to see all of the challenges that come when you're finding yourself repeatedly at the bottom of the pyramid. Having you and your grandkids come and just play with other kids as if they are peers, which they of course are. Like I think that could be just as powerful as bringing something from the grocery store.
Yeah. I agree. I totally agree.
I wish I was a Warren Buffett or somebody right now who just had all of this office space. And even if I couldn't house everybody in every home or in every cubicle, I wish that I could at least think of all of the leftover space that I would have in my commercial space. And whether it's a living space, whether it's a play date space, whether it's it's raining outside, let's eat together space. Like, I know that might be a little Pollyanna pie in the sky right now, but you've really inspired me, Paul, to just think about what that could look like, and whether it's a housing issue, food issue, or any other issue, like, who could I sit around the table with and have a discussion about who needs what we have left over? Who needs what we have in abundance? Who needs what we have in the proverbial Tupperware bowl? And I want to thank you for that. I definitely want to thank you for that. Cathey, I already see the wheels turning. The smoke's coming off the air. The crown has already been placed on the top of the concept queen. Go ahead, girl.
You were just saying something, Mark. You were saying something that made me just think of a little idea, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. We've been talking this whole time, and I just thought about how to handle one of the challenges. And one of the challenges that Paul talked about was that there's other tenants or there's other people in these spaces, and so there's a lot of challenges that could happen. But what if we could take certain spaces? What if they could designate certain spaces to very specific things? Like, for instance, there's one whole floor in an office building somewhere that's set up as a job interview space. So that whole space might have a place where people could come and borrow clothes that they could wear. Like, if somebody's trying to get a job and trying to be, willfully employed. And so very specific things, because that could make it very different than just the housing aspect of it. And it still contributes a little bit. And it also designates some of that space. Anyway, even that alone is the power of people coming together and using their brain. But I thought that could be one of the solutions to consider, Paul.
I agree completely. I think there are problems with this idea, but one of the ideas I had was, let's say we got 10 stories, right? The first story should be, in essence, publicly available bathrooms that are clean, right? I mean, how many places do we all go into these days with the signs that scream at you, bathrooms are for paying customers only? Like, let's remove some of the stigma of needing to pee, right? When you have no access to a bathroom, right? And, I've recently encountered some of the people that are doing really great work in this space, and showers are another thing. Laundry facilities are another thing. So what if we assume like the main floor of whatever this 10-story building is, it's really these sorts of short-term services. Second story is beds for people who just need a one-night solution. The heat's really bad, the cold's really bad. They got to come in and get out of the weather. But this isn't something long-term. They're not even looking for a long-term. They just need some short-term help. Next level above that is you have some sort of basic needs. You don't know what your long-term situation is going to be, but you need access to something a little bit more stable. Fourth floor to sixth floor is going to be, the people who are actually like living situation, whatever that needs to be. And then you still get to a couple floors left. And that's where the service is. I think, now you're talking about, let's just use 100. I don't think the number really matters, but we'll use 100. You got 100 people living in this place on a regular basis. They're going to need mental health services. They're going to need some trauma recovery services. They're going to need maybe job coaching services if they want to go back into the workforce. Finance, like education, children's education, daycare, like these are all services you would want to have if your goal of that building was to build a community that, takes care of each other, right? And ultimately, some of the jobs that you would offer would be keeping that first floor clean, or watching the kids, or walking people's dogs if they go to work. We are, just because of the cost of real estate, we are in a situation where a lot of people who do work still don't feel very housing stable. Whether they're barely living month to month, or they're living in their cars, or they're living on a friend's couch, like things are getting tight. And frankly, I wish this wasn't true, but I don't think that's a problem that's going to go away after the election. I think this is still going to be a very difficult space to feel stable in your housing. So, how do we actually build a community which just happens to look like a big office building?
I love that.
I love that too, yeah.
I love that a lot.
Paul, I'm glad you just said that, because the reality of your engineering energy, and I wrote that down, your engineering energy.
Oh, I love that. I love that. That's so good.
You have been very clear that we're not going to solve the world's problem in one day, and we're probably not going to be able to solve every person's issue, right? We're not going to get everybody. And so I'm so glad that you said that, because you're not showing up in this space to be the one who figures it out for everyone. We can't do that alone at the table anyway. Right?
That's exactly right.
But you have given us a lot to think about. For me, again, it's the leftovers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to look at those Tupperware bowls the same way, because I'm going to be thinking about how does that translate to other people's needs. And the other thing that really stuck with me was that question about what is the basic minimum that all humans need in terms of clothing and housing and food. So many different things have come up, Paul. And I'm just wondering, after this conversation that we've had, like, what's something that's sticking with you that you're going to take to that big communal meal when you get the whole network together? What is something from this conversation that you're taking away to that table?
Yeah, I really like the idea of, first of all, just try to start doing something, and then I'll run into the obstacles when I find the people that are doing it. I thought that was really good from Cathey. And similarly, how do we start creating the opportunity for people to opt into helping with a solution? I'm paraphrasing. That's not exactly what anybody said, but even if it is an app, or even if it is some sort of community message board where you can look for where opportunities are to bring your children to visit with other children, or to help watch somebody's dog when they are looking for a place to stay that doesn't allow dogs, whatever. There are people out there who would like an opportunity to engage even just quote unquote a little, but that little bit can go a long way. So I would say those are two of the biggest things I'm taking away from this today.
Awesome.
Mm.
Awesome. And Cathey, I shared mine. So just real quick, what's sticking with you?
Oh my gosh, I love so many things we chatted about today, but I love just this idea of, trying to find the how can we and not the, oh, we can't, it's too big. And because of that big overarching question, I think there were a lot of the things that you two just mentioned were some of the direct, things. But I love that bigger idea of taking a problem and just going, okay, how could I? What could I do? How could I? How could I contribute? How can I make, and how can I look at my life with leftovers different? So all of that like really resonates with me a lot.
Well, how could I and how can we? So, Paul, how could the people who are watching find out more about you and the work you do and maybe figure out a way to contribute and join you at the big communal table?
Totally. I love it. So I'll just give an email address that's really easy. Paul, Paul, at team, Team, Cinder, Cinder.com. If you're interested in this topic at all, I would love to hear from you, especially if you actually are already working in this space and you have some ideas. To me, that's a big part of what I would love to be connected with. Secondly, I'm not very active on social media, but I am on LinkedIn. And if you just search for Paul Brown Cinder, Cinder, you can find me. It's also linkedin.com/in/Paul Cinder, Paul-Cinder. So any of those ways, I'd love to hear from your audience. I think it would be super fun to connect with people as a result of appearing on here today.
Awesome. Well, what I could say to everybody who's going to be reaching out and contributing to you, anybody who wants to sit around that communal table and figure out what kind of leftovers they can provide for those who have some basic needs and just need a helping hand. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your heart. Thank you for your heart in the form of a home. May your heart be a home to so many other people. And to anybody out there who's got the heart, the home, and the idea to share with Cathey and I, please hit us up at It's About to Go Down show. Marc with a C, Cathey with an E. You know we like to do this unique. But the one common thing we love to do is have idea conversations with you. So we hope you enjoyed this conversation. We hope you join us for the next conversation, because every time we get together, it's about to go down.